Welcome to Agency Acquisitions and Exits. I'm your host, Peter Legg. Today, we welcome back Peter Baldwin, the dangerous CFO who I've had the pleasure of hosting many of these episodes with. In addition, doing a lot of deals together. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different, Peter. We're actually going to create something very useful and specific and practical, hopefully. How's that sound?
Sounds good to me. Let's do it.
Now, in my agency M&A community, everyone always asks the same question, which is, okay, Peter, deal structures. Peter and I have a whole series on creative financing where we touch on this, so link in the description, go follow along. But when it comes to how to structure a deal, we think an illustrative, a visual, is very helpful. And this is one that we used in a deal, and we're going to walk you through the specifics, give you a little bit of context, and then hopefully explain the black box that is acquiring a business, rollover equity, in a future divestiture. Okay. What you're seeing on the screen, and if you're listening to this episode, you can't see it because it's not on YouTube or on a video format, go to the description, download the file, and follow along, because it'll be hard to follow along without the visual. What you're seeing presented is a visual representation of a proposed deal structure between us, this was a party for Peter and I, and an owner of a business. Now, this has no numbers in it, Peter. We're going to show some numbers, but what are some of the things that are important for us to highlight in this, I call it empty version?
Without getting into the specifics of the target example we're going to talk about, this essentially follows the value path available to three different constituencies really in the transaction. The owner, who's 100% owner pre-transaction of the subject business, the CEO / senior management team of, I think of this kind of two parties. The CEO is really the key player in this particular example. And then the senior management team was a highly senior team. They also needed to be incentivized and bound to the organization post-close. And none of them had any equity stake. They essentially were all salaried employees. I mean, they weren't essentially, they were all salaried employees beforehand. And our intention was to give them equity upside and align them with the organization going forwards. Part of the narrative here as we took this transaction to the seller was, you need to help us bind your team and share some of the upside with them in such a way as to create an asset that's worth selling. Because if we couldn't bind the team to the organization, then there was no long-term value, because the owner he was not involved in the business. He was simply harvesting the cash at this point. Without that senior management team and the CEO, there really was no value to be acquired, because
correct. Yeah, we pay present value for future expectations. And if the company was printing profits like this one was, but the owner who we're negotiating with is not involved day to day, the future profits are heavily reliant on the people who are staying. And so we were approaching this, although it wasn't originally part of the seller's ideal exit, as we need to mitigate this risk, and we have some creative ways we want to approach it. We also circulated this with that CEO to say, we want to make sure you're incentivized and you're enthusiastic. And so this is a very important way for you all to understand that when you approach a company, sometimes when you're talking and negotiating in spreadsheets, it's just not easy to understand. So we created an illustrative example so we could kind of make sure there's alignment on how we're approaching it, because we're presenting it to many stakeholders.
Yeah, one of the things we commented, I think it was in the third podcast episode we did together, is that at the end of the day, the employees get a vote whether or not they're a direct stakeholder. This is the best example of that we have really in our legacy together, because this was a team that was, all the value was being driven by senior management, and none of them were equity holders, and none of them had long-term contracts. And so all of the kind of the diligence watchouts that you have in a transaction were present here. Great business, high customer concentration, which was another thing we dealt with in structuring on this transaction, but not really the subject today. And a management team that absolutely had to be engaged, conversed with, and sold on the deal, even though they weren't the seller per se.
Yep. And just to give some color commentary to this deal as we're about to walk through it, as Peter highlighted, high customer concentration, key person risk in the business, also a significant contract renewal. So when you see the payment dates, these things were tied to things we identified as risk. With risk goes value. And Peter and I talked about that multiple times in our series together. And you'll see this deal structure reflect that. I'm going to slide over into a numbers example so people can follow along here. And then we're going to explain what the things are, how we thought about it. And I'm going to provide kind of some negotiation context, as I was the person interacting directly with the owner and the CEO on this. And my storyline was really simple. Hey, owner, you have a high caliber executive. You have running this company that has an executive team who's vital to the retention of this client. And that client that has significant income and revenue concentration on the business is renewing shortly after our deal transact. These are things I need to figure out how to address in order to move forward with this deal. Now, there was a reason that this company was looking to transact. And so we did have a deadline. We had to make a move. So we didn't have the luxury of saying, let's wait till after the contract's renewed. So in this instance, I approached the owner and said, here's what we need to do. I need to take a portion of the purchase price. I need to incentivize you to stick with us because we're going to build value here. So that shows you as an investor, you're putting some skin in the game, which is a good signal for us and a good signal for the team that's remaining. And I also need you to give a portion of the value of this business to your CEO at his discretion to what to do with. And so what you're going to see here is the stakeholders that Peter was describing. This CEO got to choose what was the makeup of that percentage to his team. And we'll kind of walk through the bits here. And we kind of built this illustration so people could see that this is how we were going to split the business. This is how we were going to treat it. Here's how the installment plan on the payments of the business. Here's how we were going to handle things like the rollover equity, the capital contribution. Here's how we were going to incentivize the team through our growth period all the way to our divestiture. Peter, let's start with the owner's deal, and then we'll get to the team side. We had a purchase price, we had a value, we had a timing of the installment payments. Maybe explain how we are treating rollover equity at this stage.
So in this particular case, we treated the rollover equity as, effectively a reinvest. I mean, it's what rollover equity is, right? He got the headline purchase price number, which if you do the math here is you can see between the rollover equity he gets and the seller note he gets, it's about 10 million. Rollover equity portion, the 3 million, he essentially contributed. So it was essentially non-cash in the transit, but it was treated as cash into a 20% equity stake in the combined new entity. That was, LLC Class B shares, non-voting, typical fundamental protections for fundamental changes in the business, but no hand in the operations. And then in addition to that, there was a seller note, which actually amortized off in 3 tranches. The total value of the seller note was 7 million. And the initial tranche of the seller note was timed to hit on the later of the contract renewal. And actually was it 6 months or 3 months post sale, Peter? I thought it was 6, but
yeah, and it ended up being 6 after this.
Yeah, and I think the original construct was we talked about 3, but because we hadn't had the RFP, the bid for the key customer contract had not come out yet. But as it was when we closed, it hit the metal and the award came, I think, 4.5 months after the deal closed.
Yeah, so the way we've defined this in the companies that Peter and I work directly with is there's ways to structure installment payments. You can do it by time. You can do it by event.
Yeah, trigger.
So all these things are triggers that, again, are shared risk and uncertainty that the buyer's assuming with this seller. And then that's how these get structured in regards to payouts. And so that was the sequence of events that we negotiated with. And then that left a balance. So 67% about was the consideration for the seller, and then 33%, became available consideration that we were going to use in the form of retention bonuses for the CEO, and then the CEO at his discretion could allocate to his executive team. Anyone he wanted, really. We gave him full control over that.
So yeah, this was split. You can see from the chart here that consideration for the employee group was split into a package of, it ended up being $2 million in cash and $3 million in rollover equity. Is probably not entirely the right terminology here, but we were talking about it in that concept. It was profits interest units, PIUs, and an LLC, non-voting with a threshold turn that ensured that the capital basis of both the Class A shareholders, which was our firm, and the Class B shareholder, or the Class B member rather, which was the selling shareholder of the prior organization who rolled into the equity of the new organization, that was the threshold on that they had to get their cash back, right? Their capital accounts had to be drained to zero before they could participate.
And
so
I want to, well, let's highlight that because it's important. Whenever you as a buyer are taking on a business that has, revenue concentration or client concentration or has key person risk, the rollover equity or the deferment of consideration in the form of equity-like treatment are things that they have available to them to demonstrate to us their confidence in staying in the go-forward business. And so that's what we were asking the team to demonstrate to us. We also had another provision on that, which was we plan on divesting this in the future. And so we wanted to also make sure we demonstrate to the next buyer that these people are going to be sticky for them too.
We obviously this is an important note, and it's a good call out on your part. It was pre-negotiated. We didn't have to wait. We did not wait until we were in negotiations to sell this asset to try to strike a deal with management about rolling over into the next entity on their equity stake. We pre-established that, where the deal was they got essentially profits interest or a management incentive plan that was value from an equity stake after capital contributions of 20% of the group. The entirety of that, only a portion of it actually vested on an exit event. The rest of it was essentially forcibly rolled at buyer discretion into the next entity, where they had to hold, and I believe it actually says in here, they had to hold for like another, I think it was 12 or 24 months, 12 months afterwards before they could cash in on any of that. So essentially it was a retention. If we look under the 36-month bucket, like right under the CEO team, it's transaction 2 plus 12 months is when they could get their payouts, right? That's when they began. And as such, it was a way for us to communicate to a future buyer of this asset. They had a management team who was locked in and incentivized to ensure that they were maximizing equity value after we sold the company, not just while we were preparing it for sale.
Yeah, this is when we talk about beginning with the end in mind. We knew we were an intermediary owner. We were investing in to have an interim period of ownership, and we were going to transact with a private equity-backed strategic a few years down the line. And since we knew that as stated intentions, we made sure that we had a pre-packaged company and team that allowed for that. So it sets the right expectations from the beginning. Now, there was the cash involved. Let's talk about how we structure retention bonuses, because I think that's an important call out.
I want to jump back for a moment though. You mentioned that we began with the end in mind and expected to sell this to a PE-backed strategic. It wasn't in the generic sense, PE-backed strategic. We knew who the buyer was. We knew who the buyer was. Very strong belief who the buyer was going to be.
Well, without getting too specific, because I'm trying to for confidentiality and private reasons, I do want to say my approach to the market is really simple. I know who will buy the thing in the future before I start a project. And in this specific instance, we were proactive at discussing opportunities with said buyer. And they said, well, we'll follow along on the journey, keep us abreast of the situation. And so this is available to all businesses. There's always a bigger, maybe financially backed strategic who would be interested in buying what you're doing in the future. And you can talk to them today and present your plan, your thesis, discuss the opportunity, and really set expectations for what the next 3 years are going to look like, both for you as a holdco, investors, and the opco, the actual people in the day-to-day business. And so we designed this for this exit. That was his intention. And this illustration was very helpful in us communicating that, because you'll see here purchase agreement, employment agreements, incentive unit plans, and then cash consideration. That's also tied to the same sequencing that the seller was being paid on the installment plan.
Yeah, we had milestone payments for incentive payments, retention payments for each of the CEO and team members. And those are not exactly uniform amounts as a proportion throughout the sequence either. For some of those team members who to be completely candid, we weren't 100% sold on, we back-ended those, right? Where the vast majority of the retention bonus was paid if you were around in 24 months. For others, we split them more evenly in the way that the CEO's comp here was split, which was roughly, what was it? It was like 25% up front, and the other 75% was split over the payments 2 and 3. But for team members, and you're under no orders to make it, to make those numbers equal or proportionate. And we designed all of these incentives for team member based on what we thought about the team member and their long-term fit to the organization.
Yeah, that's in the census. We looked at how long someone had been at the company, their roles with the direct clients, their potential role in the growing organization. We looked at what our recommendation was and what the CEO ultimately wanted to give as consideration and retention bonus to these folks.
Also, the potential utility for the ultimate buyer that we expected to acquire to sell this asset to. Because if you look at specific roles, some of those roles are unlikely. They're likely to be duplicative when you're acquired into a strategic. And so for people whose roles were unlikely to be needed by the strategic buyer, we back-ended that comp.
And we also knew that there was a potential for, and we ended up releasing someone who was more senior, who just wasn't the right fit, and we appropriately back-ended that retention bonus. So that individual, although left on good terms, although it was appropriate, wasn't needing the reward that we were giving the people who showed loyalty and stuck through with us.
And we also had some mid-junior personnel, sort of mid-level and junior personnel who their initial we thought they were flight risks. And for some, we were indifferent to that flight risk, and others we were not indifferent and wanted to hold on to them and said, we need them at least this long. And so for people we were thinking, we need them at least this long, we gave them a bigger chunk up front in the 6-month target for the retention bonus. Whereas for the junior people we thought were flight risks, but we were less focused on kind of longer term, we staged that out. So it was, I think we ended up paying out in terms of the team. I think we paid out about 80%, 75% of the retention pool to the team. And that was because of some not particularly regrettable voluntary attrition plus some involuntary attrition. And then obviously, we delivered the core team to the ultimate buyer when we divested the asset.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about what this does to the headline purchase price and the structure. For those who maybe aren't following along specifically on our visual, we essentially started, chopping down that cash consideration in creative ways to adjust for the identified risk and uncertainty of the business. So, Peter, headline number on this transaction based on what we're showing here, what we do, and then how did we cut it down?
Well, I mean, the way I think it's important to think about this in a couple of different ways. The accountant in me, which looks at this,
as a small part of you, by the way.
It is a very small part of me, but I also have to think about how this gets accounted for. The purchase price accounting, it showed the equity roll, it showed the seller note, and that's all the upfront purchase price. The rest of it is essentially it's deferred it's incentive program, which is, technically speaking, it's ordinary course.
Ordinary income,
and it's ordinary course income to the recipients. It's not rollover equity or any value like that. The rollover value that we described to the team was profits and interest units, which was essentially contingent equity that was delivered over a time period. So again, not part of the total number. So we had essentially 5 million in what we described as, headline consideration for this business. Like we're putting 15 million of value into here, and it's a combination of 10 million for the seller and a $5 million package for the employees, consisting of 2 million of retention comp and 3 million of equity value in PIUs. So from a purchase price perspective, it was 10 million. From a headline, here's how we're looking at the business from a total value perspective. We were giving them, 15 million in total value, but 10 of it was boilerplate purchase price.
And let's make sure this is clear. When we first saw the business, which was, 3 million in profit, we said 5 times. Like very clearly, 3 million of profit equals 5 times. You don't know that this is what is needed until you start looking under the hood of businesses. You can't just see a market business and think this is what is warranted to mitigate uncertainty and risk. It's when you start having conversations with the seller, having conversations with the operators in the business, maybe the leadership, or review through a Q of E the contracts and really flag things as concerns, do you start saying, how do I need to structure this? What would have to be true for us to move forward with the transaction, but mitigate these very apparent risks? And that's where creativity comes in. Where Peter and I really align mentally is just on the creative problem solving to still get a deal done. Like where other people might have seen insurmountable effort and had in the past with this seller, I just couldn't get there. We figure out a way to structure it that makes sense. And so what I'm trying to share through this illustration is it takes some creativity, takes some effort. These aren't things that just show up day one and now this is your template of how you do all your deals. I wish it was that easy, right, Peter? Like just imagine if we just always did every deal the same way.
Yeah, walk in, blueprint, cash on close, away we go. All done. No, it's never that easy, and you have to. I mean, maybe it's just years of the space in which I've practiced, but in general, if it seems that easy, I start to get very suspicious.
Yeah, and it's also important there is a spreadsheet behind the math. So, Peter, let's talk quickly. You still had to model all of this, amortize it. The accountant and you and the finance version had to come together to say, okay, well, how is this going to play out over time in order for us to present this package to the sellers?
Yeah. So, well, there's difference between the spreadsheet we presented and the spreadsheet, the work behind it. Like, it's like an iceberg, right? 90% of it's below the waterline and never sees the light of day. But we had to build all the plumbing to forecast this business out on a monthly basis over, 5 years. Really monthly for the first 12. You probably can get away with quarterly after that. But in practical terms, I always kind of build the infrastructure on a monthly basis, at least for 3 years.
And this was a negative working capital business. So let's also set that as
their biggest client was paid in like net 12.
Yeah. So when we were able to forecast future performance, it was more the components of the business that had some degree of upsell, cross-sell nuance. But even then, we were able to build a fairly confident model given the track record of this business with its clients.
Yeah, the vendor base that served those, most of this cost was payroll, right? But even there, we were effectively negative working capital because the single largest client, which was more than 50% of the overall revenue of the business, was paying inside of the payroll cycle. And then the vendor cycle was net 30, typically speaking. And so we were well inside of that, which allowed us to grow and take on other business without really creating massive working capital pressure going forward. So the real question for this particular business, as we modeled it out, was just the cash flows associated with this deal on the page. Are we going to be able to support the seller note outflows? Are we going to be able to support the retention comp timing? Are we going to be able to do all that over the next 6, 12, 24, 36 months before we exit? And then what package are we turning over? What does the consideration look like to the various stakeholders at exit? What is the owner who rolled, what's his likely check look like at exit? How much of that are we compelling him to roll into the successor package, if you will? You can see here essentially, I'm trying to recall the exact details.
Well, just for again, the color commentary on this was we wanted to make sure that we showed up as a buyer, people stayed. We didn't want to go to market and then, yay, everyone's deferred considerations now accelerated on our divestiture. And now they're like, I'm good. I don't want to be here anymore. So we
Yeah.
had to bake into it, hey, pot committed, everybody is participating. And again, that was negotiated at the very beginning, which took some negotiation because we had to be very candid and transparent to say, this is the reason why we're asking you to do this. And this is why it's beneficial for the buyer. And if it's beneficial for the buyer, it's probably going to be beneficial for you.
And we also indicated a willingness to, put a bunch of our own cash on the come with the future buyer if need be as well, and defer consideration along these same timelines. And we didn't end up having to do that, but it was something we were willing to offer. And if you look under the hood here and you see that essentially both the original owner, the original seller, and the management team were retaining effectively 9%. You'll see that we had diluted them down to 12% in this model. 75% of their consideration was retained and holding over post the cash payments from the sale. And even those cash payments from the sale were deferred to 12 months post close. So we're talking about, their initial 25% of their equity stake, so 3 points in the fully diluted model here for each of the management team as well as the rolling shareholder, was paid out 12 months post close, and the balance of that was held in roll to the buyer. So again, we bound not only from an employment contract perspective, but from an equity payout perspective, we bound the relevant stakeholders. I mean, buyer didn't want the old equity owners in the cap structure, so they were more than happy to cash them out. But the management team, they did incentivize with PIUs and effectively did a swap into new equity at the other entity, which bound them to the PIUs of that entity with its own vesting stake and what have you, which was part of the negotiation of that exit transaction, which isn't today's conversation, but it is relevant.
Yeah. So, I mean, at a high level, this was a $3 million in profit, 5 times profit valuation, structured in a way that tied the key people and addressed risks of uncertainty with contract renewal and client concentration. But we still showed them the total available value. So although the deal ultimately gets structured at close to 3x, right? 3 million of profit, 10 million.
Yeah, we were like
to the seller.
3.3 times and
3.3 times
purchase price,
which would be
5
classified as
times in total value.
Yeah, 5 times in total value, three-ish, which would be below market for a company of this level of profit. We also were able to show them that the goal line in this transaction was not the first deal with us, it was the second bite. And so maybe explain, Peter, the two end outcomes for the stakeholders, the team, and the seller, and how that compares to the entry transaction.
Okay, so I have to tread carefully here because I am subject to a confidentiality agreement on the ultimate economics of this transaction. So I'll speak in generalities. But the original seller, the original owner of the business, he, took his consideration through. There was a restructuring of the seller note, which allowed us to do a deal with the ultimate buyer, on a more accelerated timeline. And he took some of his consideration in the form of a note, as well as, swapping out his equity into another piece of consideration with that same buyer. At the end of the day, he played it forward. and played for the long-term value and committed to that over time. So it was as expected.
And then for the team, the team had within it some expectation. Now, keep in mind, for everyone who's listening to this, the team originally didn't have a player on the field in this transaction. It was our entry transaction that opened the door for them to participate as stakeholders in this deal. And so, again, they had an opportunity when we were divesting that we were able to say, hey, this is what you're going to get with us, but this is what we want you to get when we recapitalize the business, when we sell the company.
Yeah, I mean, the management team went from being salary-only employees to being equity stakeholders with meaningful participation in the upside of the go-forward business through the change of control, not only to us, but the change of control to the ultimate buyer. And that was
Yeah. And
obviously,
again,
very much their motivation.
Yeah, and it should. And so when we're doing transactions in the marketplace, it's really important for us to, in the early conversations with sellers, ask how they are incentivizing their team. It can't just be a thank you check for their service when they sell. We want to acquire a company that is sticky with clients and revenue, and sticky with people. And it takes understanding that these types of transactions require you to maybe rethink how the consideration is going to be spread around in ways that de-risk the future of the business. Peter, is there anything else we want to highlight as this illustrative example to kind of like close out?
I think on a meta level, it really is a good case study in how to understand the motivations and of not only the seller, but also the key stakeholders, how to de-risk those factors, how to design uh, a, a buyout with the exit in mind, and to you know, custom tailor those conditions to create the outcome you want. And I think in this case, we understood the separate and distinct motivations of the various parties at interest, tailored the consideration and the incentive packages to play to their particular interests. And I don't mean that in a manipulative sense, but we understood their motivations. And it's not a bad thing to ask those questions as you're doing a transaction. In fact, it's an important thing to understand. And as you noted, employees aren't in for the gold watch, right? They want a piece of the game, most of them. And so with a management team like that, it's critical that you design your transaction to accommodate those interests, and you design the transaction around those motivations in order to both acknowledge them and maximize the outcome for all the parties involved that help hit them in the ways that they're looking to benefit from the deal.
Yeah. And this also comes from our experience in deals. We've done a lot of transactions. And so we think of deal design as a craft, right? It's not a science where the inputs equal outputs. It's not an art where it's made up. It's a craft, Peter. You and I both really enjoy figuring out what it needs to look like in order for the deal to get done, even with risks. There's always risk and uncertainty with businesses. And it's important that you have folks around you who help you structure it. We call it deal design, help you structure the capital stack in order to move forward with these types of deals efficiently and hopefully conservatively. And this is the kind of thing that we talk about every single day in our agency M&A community. This is what we talk about our events. This is the fun bit of what we do, right, Peter? We enjoy this part of the work all day, every day.
I mean, yeah, the thing I like about my job is the ability to be creative and strategic. I can do the less creative and strategic parts, but they don't really nourish me in the way that finding a creative way to structure a deal that delivers an outcome that everyone else was like, how the heck did you get that done? To me, that's the fun part. The shelf behind me is stuff that's memorable for those reasons. You know, the restructuring that nobody said could get done, or the financing that somebody said was too complicated, or have you.
Yeah. If you're listening to this and you're saying, well, Peter, I do not have the reps to be able to do this. I don't have the creativity to go out and buy something of sizable profit, millions in profit, and how to structure that. This is exactly why we host the events we host. We have the community we do. And Peter is a valued contributor to all of that as well. And so we welcome you. We do these types of deal breakdowns and reviews privately to our exclusive community. See the description if you're interested in it. And if you like this type of content, wherever you heard it, watched it, leave us a comment so it makes Peter and I want to do more of it. At the end of the day, we want to create artifacts and resources that help you get deals done. We want buyers to be better buyers and sellers to be better sellers. Peter, as always, I appreciate your time and partnership throughout all these types of opportunities and deals.
My pleasure. It's always a joy. I really enjoy our collaboration.